through your research, what are you finding are some ways to create tangibility?
This is a great question, and perhaps the greatest of all questions, because this is really what we're grappling with. We have structures in the world, economic structures, political structures, social structures, sort of the rules that we have sort of organized our life around, and that's not easy to change. But we know from research that it can change.
Welcome back, everybody. Richard Baker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with global executives, academics, nonprofit leaders, all about the work they're doing to solve the challenges that we see in our environment, society, and economy. My simple goal here is to basically inspire and equip the next generation of ambassadors to hopefully help them along their career path, help them in their current jobs, or help them just try and find out the ways that they can collaborate across the spectrum of different individuals, different organizations, all trying to tackle these problems. And in this episode, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Bjorn-Ola Linnér. He's a member of the Research Council on the Swedish Environment Protection Agency and its Scientific Council for Ecosystem Services and Biological Diversity. So with that, Bjorn, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I initially came across your work actually through your paper on sustainable development and AI, and for me, that's a really big area of interest, and it looks like it's a growing area of interest for many of us in the space. So it's great to have you here. Maybe as a starting point, introduce yourself and a little bit about the work that you've been doing.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Yeah. So my research, as you kindly introduced, is very much focused on the geopolitics of sustainability. And there is both challenges and opportunities in how the world politics develops. And I think it's crucial if we're going to succeed with the goals or not. But that's shortly what I'm interested in. And in that part, artificial intelligence, of course, it will impact the way that we can do we can govern sustainability issues in the future. There are new tools, but they can also new challenges with that, of course.
So you've been an academic in this space for quite a while, and I'm curious, how did you get to become a kind of sustainable academic, and what has been your area of focus over the years?
Yeah, well, this was already back in the 80s when I was at the University of Lund, and there was a lot of discussion on sort of where are the world heading. We got the Brundtland report on that time, sort of the first major report which had sort of actors from the global south and the global north to see what are the predicaments of the world. And then so that was awakening for me. And then I thought when I started to think about it, that a PhD might be a possibility. Then I was at a lecture. I remember this very clearly in the big hall at the University of Lund, and it was a quite well-known environmentalist at that time, and he came from the natural sciences because I'm a trained social scientist. And then he said, "Well, if you want to truly change the world, you as social sciences and humanities people, then you must understand the sort of the basis of these problems, because otherwise your solutions might not be the right ones." And to me, that was a sort of an awakening call. So then I thought, okay, yeah, I better pursue some interdisciplinary program so I truly understand the problems that we are dealing with.
How do you see these two balancing, or what's the interplay or what's the interlink between the two subjects that you think is so interesting or so powerful?
By nature, if you want to deal with environmental issues, climate issues, or the wider sustainability agenda, that is, of course, not a natural science problem or a social science problem or humanities or medicine. We need to have competences from all these areas. And that has been the strength over the last two decades, to see how interdisciplinary research have evolved in teams. Otherwise, it's really hard to tackle these issues because it needs a broad understanding.
And for that point, like, what are some of the topics that you've covered in the past, say 20 years? Like, what have you had a single focus during that time? Do you kind of look at different issues and bounce around and try and figure out the bigger problem? Like, how do you approach your research, and what are some of the topics that you've covered?
Well, the beauty of getting older, as I am, you can see how things connect over the years, right? So I started with focus on the food security issues and the sort of the post-war policy and discussions on a rising world population and diminishing resources, especially than food. And then from that, I went into the broader sustainability agenda, because I thought that was sort of very much what happened in policymaking, was to see how these issues were taken into a broader context. And then, of course, a key issue as it evolved in the late 90s and early 2000s was climate change, how that sort of impeded on food security, on the prospect of sustainable development. So then that became my major focus over the years. But the climate focus has led me very much to what we partly discussed today, sort of how can we communicate these things? Because when I started with climate policy research in the early 2000s, one of the core problems, and it's still a major challenge for us, is how can we make the effects of climate change tangible for people who don't really, well, you can see a warm day or a cold day and so on, but the climate issue, sort of the longer trends and what that means for our lives and what it entails for a societal transformation, that's very hard to grasp. I think it's very abstract. So we had the fortune to work here at my university with world-leading visualization researchers.
I talk a lot about this is one of the biggest challenges I think we face. I mean, not just individuals and consumers, but policymakers and business leaders. The idea of tangibility, I was in Vietnam about a month and a half ago, on the back of a motor scooter thinking, how can you tell 100 million people to go backwards 30 years just to save the world from a Western construct? Like for them, it's very tangible. When I've been speaking with people from Africa, Southeast Asia, in very high risk environments that are seeing 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, for them, it's tangible, but they don't really have the levers to do anything about it. It's the problem is, in Western Europe and in the US where things are a little bit, we're not seeing it as bluntly. We need them to make the change. I'm curious, like through your research or through these interactions, what are you finding are some ways to create tangibility?
Yeah, well, I think this is a great question, and perhaps the greatest of all questions, because this is really what we're grappling with, and it's not an easy answer, because we have structures in the world, economic structures, political structures, social structures, sort of the rules that we have sort of organized our life around, and that's not easy to change. But we know from research that it can change through our actions, through the practices. It is possible to change the structures, but that's a slow process. And given your example, I think that's a great example. I work quite a lot with colleagues at Fiji, and of course that's another definitely sort of you can see the effects of climate change, and it really affects the everyday life. So what we've seen through the last 10 years, or at least since 2015, a very strong push towards talking about societal transformations. What is a hope there is that we then talk about what is a good life ahead, now and ahead. So it's not about going back 30 years. It's about seeing how can we create something new that is better, that we value more.
Well, and this is where if I go back to Vietnam, and maybe you can draw off your Fiji research, is that for the Vietnamese and for the, like I could be in Thailand, I could be in Indonesia, for them, that better life is what they're actually doing. They're achieving a better life through economic development, through the work environment, through creating productivity. And that's actually leading towards more of these challenges around sustainability, say meat consumption, energy use, water use. So there's this balance. But my question would be then, who decides what is better, or who leads the discussion? I really struggle with how do you find that balance, or how do you find that path forward if it's from an outside in approach versus the inside out?
And that's a continuous discussion and negotiations within countries, within societies, local communities, and nations, but also internationally. What a good life is, it's very personal. But there are some fundamentals that we should be able to agree on. But we will never find a perfect. There will not be one answer, of course, not with 8 billion people. But if we have the multilateral systems, we come at least a bit closer. We have a better ground there. Okay, but then we have to be very, very, very clear that what you value today as the good life, that might be threatened if we don't take action.
I'm just going to refer back to this trip because it's fresh in my mind. But I was down there, and they have an energy crunch in part because the hydro is down, so they have water issues. Just like many other parts of the world, the hydropower is down, so they have to bring up more coal, in part because the cost of renewables is too high. And one, there still isn't really an agreement on how to transfer IP technology to the global south or to underdeveloped nations, but also the financing involved hasn't really been agreed upon as well. So yeah, I mean, I keep coming back to these kind of these challenges where it's like we know where we need to go, but there's all these kind of barriers in the way. And having your reflection, it's great, because I think we need to create these frameworks where we can actually create the dialogue and then hopefully get to what I believe is to be the scalable solution.
Well, yeah, and I think that goes back to the question that we need a structural change as well, and that's not easy to achieve. One example, which I think is great for this, is that sort of the renewed discussion on that we need to do something about the debt in the world, so the country debt, because we know that when countries need to adapt to climate change, so take Fiji for instance, it's going to be very costly. But if countries are in debt, then it doesn't matter if we send more support for climate issues, because that will be eaten up by the interest rates they have when they're going to pay back the loans. So now there is a really push internationally with world leaders. They all come together to discuss, okay, how could this be possible? And this is a discussion that's been on since the 1970s. But now we see that it's a greater acceptance for addressing this. This is very much driven by Barbados, which has done a fantastic job. But the acceptance that we can see that it is possible to change sort of the rules of the game eventually. It takes time, but it is possible. Structures are made up by the collective actions. So when we change our practices, that's a pressure towards a structured change eventually.
Well, I want to open up to your recent research around sustainability, AI, and governance. Sustainability, AI, and governance, like that's going to be a great theme for a lot of the ways that we look at how do we make change? How do we make sure that change is done the right way? How do we, have these discussions and things? So I'm curious, maybe introduce your study and a little like the key questions that you were seeking to answer.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think starting by technology is in a way never neutral, that it always serves some interest and some will benefit and some might struggle. And of course, we know that there's a huge set of technologies that develop so fast, it's hard to keep up. So we wanted to nuance that discussion. What AI technologies as beneficial, why, and what will that do to our thinking about what is possible to govern and how we can govern sustainability issues? And so that's why the first studies were just to map the sort of how different international organizations and countries engage with AI for sustainability. And now we try to dig deeper into that to see how are they used and what will be sort of the environmental benefits, what will that do to our possibilities to cooperate, and what are the drawbacks. And we know that US and China is at advantage because of all the data it required to develop and train AI. So and EU is trying to keep up. But other countries fear that also these technologies might be used to keep them at an economic disadvantage. For instance, we have these discussions on the carbon border adjustments, so the carbon the tolls on or tariffs on goods that have a higher carbon content outside the EU. Could we use AI to keep track on that? Yeah, well, it's very hard to get the data, so it might not be possible. But if it would be possible, of course, some countries would feel that, well, they would be at a disadvantage. What is the transparency on how these tools are used? The same thing with surveillance. If we use satellite AI satellite image that we analyze through AI to keep track on carbon emissions, which is possible. And it could be a fantastic asset, but that might also create a distrust among countries that don't have sort of the technology where they think that this information might be black box and so.
Broadly speaking, what were some of the major findings or that you came away with from this piece of research or from this article?
The primary finding is that policymakers seem to be dealing with AI in a very sort of general way rather than engaging with them in practice. I think that can be a bit worrying, I think. So we need to go into specific technologies and look at specific cases more. Another topic that is also discussed vaguely is the responsible AI, because there is a push towards that we should deal with this responsibly. Some call for moratorium, others say that we need to sort of look at the ethics and the rules. And I think that's always important in all technological development. I think our understanding of AI is still very, very general and conceptual.
And in that sense, did you find any areas where there was, say, clarity? Like you mentioned the carbon and mapping. Did you see anything like, say, with food systems or energy systems or migration? Did you find ways where there was some clarity and there was some benefit coming through that you could say, okay, look, we need to really drive for more benefit here as a starting point?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, it depends on what technologies we are talking about here. But there is a lot of experimentation going on right now, and that's sort of encouraging. That's how we do not only do research, but how we develop societies. But trying out different solutions at different places in the world and see what works. And I think that's one point that I really want to make. What might fit and be really successful with citizen science in Sweden or in Europe might not at all work in Shanghai, right? Because it's societies look so differently. So when we talk about societal transformation, I'm part of the International Science Policy Platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, where we have in an assessment there on how transformative change occurs. I think it's really important to talk about transformations in plural, and that it will play out differently around the world because we have so different politics, so different institutions, culture, social, and also we engage with technologies in different ways, even though there is a lot of similarities as well.
What are the challenges you find with communicating both the complexity of the challenge that you look at and the need for stakeholders to take action?
For a lot of research, if it's going to be trusted, we need to say, well, these are the options. Here you can explore yourself, or what would you prefer? But these are the options, these are the avenues that you can take. I think that's part of trusting research, that you can sort of feel that you have a bit of empowerment yourself over how the data will be used. And then, as we talked about, be sure to also talk, sort of bring in research. How can another world be possible, and what would that be? Because as soon as something is personal, when you feel that this is about me, then you become much more engaged and prone to listen to what your options are. Otherwise, I think another challenge, I think the second challenge that we really grapple with is sort of the clash between, we have the urgency narrative. We need to do something fast. And the faster we act, the less will the cost be in the future, both in monetary terms and in economic and social terms. But we know the structures, societal transform, that takes time. And that clash, it's very hard to grasp, I think. And so we see now, we see now a tendency when we see data on the world value surveys and so on, that there is a tendency among younger people to look for sort of more fast and perhaps easy solutions, sort of what technologies can save us. But as a social scientist, I know this is complex, this will take time, and it's not an easy thing, but it is possible.
And who would you like to work with more closely on the research you're doing? Do you want to work with more, say, private sector, more government, more nonprofit? Who are the groups that you think you need to be spending more time with, understanding them, working with them?
Well, it's actually all of that. We are constantly trying to see which are the international organizations, which are the policymakers that we need to have a dialogue with, to see what are the challenges and how would sort of different solutions work for them. Today, environmental governance is so much about public-private partnership. You see how businesses come in and really are key players, also contributors, right? And sometimes push the policymakers. So we already try to do that, but sort of finding these spaces where we can collaborate with business, civil society, environmental organizations, and international policymakers more. That is what we're trying to pursue, and that's time-consuming, and you really have, as a practitioner, you really have to see the value of this for you if you are going to spend time on it.
So what's the role of academia in your view to help understand the potential to drive conversation, to engage, anxious stakeholders?
Academia has sort of the luxury of gathering a lot of fantastic competencies from areas, from different areas, and I think that's a key contribution that we can have. That we can come together and say, well, this is what it would mean for. With these solutions, this is what would it mean for the economy, for the environment, for the social benefits, for how people's well-being. And so we have these competencies that come together. So that's a core contribution to society that we can have, that we can sort of make informed assessments. I mean, societies are complex things, but we have then the ability to deliver to make sense of this complexity. So that's a core contribution. And also, might not always be the case, we have sort of at the bottom of research the imperative of being unbiased, that we should sort of look at the data and then try to inform. Now, of course, that's not always easy to uphold, but that's sort of the imperative we have. And I think that is worth a lot in a society where you have sort of then a more divided society, where you have sort of the clash of ideologies and so on. So I think, to me, it's very important that we to the best of our ability, to maintain that, because it's for sure a core contribution from research, in my view.
if we assume that academia actually does their job and they do that, how could they better communicate the findings and the potential paths forward and, what stakeholders can do so that we can actually see more, disruption in old practice, or we can see an easier transformation for others?
If we go back to sort of one step, I think changing the incentives, the structures for researchers where that the society engagement is valued in our career paths, that is essential. And I see that more and more. I see a lot of research funding agencies then emphasizing that you need to report how the societal impact and how you will engage, what is your communication plan, and so on.
So actually, I want to jump into the fact that you're now overseeing millennials as your researchers. How are they different than PhDs from, say, 20 years ago, the Gen Xers? And are they driven into your field by the crisis becoming more tangible? Like, what's driving them into this if they're not getting, say, the recognition or the funding? What brings them into the space, and what are you finding from them in general?
First of all, I think they are much more better prepared and skilled, at least the students we get, than I was at that age. I'm really impressed sort of by what they bring in, about sort of their capacities when they go in. Many want to make a difference. I mean, they choose this because they think they see the predicaments of the world and they want to make a change. I think that has been clear that compared to my generation, the ones that I meet now, the students are much more inclined to make a difference. That's an important driver. Then I think also many don't think about research when they come to academia, but as you understand the complexity of issues and see that, okay, we need more knowledge here because there are areas we don't understand really how we can make the change, that sort of ignites hearts, I think, to dig deeper and to go forward. When they pursue a PhD, for instance, I think they are so much more well prepared and have so much more skills to bring in than I had when I started. So I think there is hope in that because there is a lot of dedicated but also extremely talented young people today. I wish we had the possibility to hire more PhDs.